560, The Answer.
You are listening to the show all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. You're listening to Get Down to Business. I'm your host, Shalom Klein. I'm thrilled to be joined by Colonel retired Paul Hettich, who is a retired Army Colonel. Paul, it's such a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you for your service.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, Paul, let's get started in talking about your background. As mentioned, you're a retired Army Colonel. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, thank you. Once again, my background, I was commissioned in 1987 from Loyola University through their ROTC program, August 26th to be exact. And I was mandatory retired on September 1st, 2017. I spent the majority of my career in the Army Reserves, some in the Army National Guard, and then a lot on active duty. And I think the highlight of my career would be my 5 combat deployments, 3 to Iraq, 1 to East Africa, and then 1 to Bosnia and Kosovo. And then probably my last one, which was quite rewarding, was a mobilization here in the States, supporting the 451st ESC out of McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita, Kansas.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, Paul, that's a perfect segue into talking about our reserve components, which is made up of the National Guard and the United States Army Reserve. I'm very passionate about this. I serve in the U.S. Army Reserves. And what role do those components play in protecting our country?
Well, that's an excellent question and something that I think is quite important, especially these days. The Army Reserves basically became an operational command or an operational reserve in 1990, and it has been ever since then. And obviously our mission and vision has changed since 1990. But since 9/11, I think that most of us would agree that between the Army National Guard and the Army Reserves, that without those reserve components, we could not achieve the various missions that we have all the way to this day. And that's everything from the wars that we fought in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the missions that we've had in Kosovo and Bosnia. And then if you look at our current situation here with COVID-19, once again, forces from all components and the Army Reserve, National Guard, and active duty as well.
So explain the Posse Comitatus Act and its limitations in terms of service. It's a frequent topic, frequent subject when we're talking about where folks can serve. When you're talking about the National Guard and the Army Reserve, you've served in both, so you certainly understand the limitations and where each component can be involved in conflict.
Well, that's an excellent question, especially with COVID-19. Obviously, the National Guard is commanded by each of our governors, and they have direct command of their Guard forces. But we also have the opportunity, especially with the Army Reserve and the active duty, to have those forces support domestic issues, such as what we're dealing with today. And in terms of Posse Comitatus, as you're talking about, it's very specific in terms of those duties which can be performed by the National Guard or the Army or the Army Reserve forces.
Absolutely. And so right now, do you know the numbers of how many people have been activated in support of COVID-19 efforts?
Not specifically, but I do receive daily updates in terms of the Army Reserve, and we have thousands of soldiers who are supporting the current situation.
And ultimately, who's in charge of the units that are activated for COVID-19 relief? Who is ultimately the commander-in-chief?
Obviously, our commander-in-chief is President Trump. But once again, each governor commands his unique forces. So here in Illinois, Governor Pritzker commands the Illinois National Guard, and he does that through his adjutant general. And then the adjutant general will decide what forces he needs, and that's determined by those capabilities that those forces have. In terms of the Army Reserve Forces, once again, we have unique capabilities, and the Army Reserve can be activated as a federal unit, but that comes from our commanding general, and that's does not occur without support from the commander-in-chief and also support from the governors.
Well, I've got to squeeze in a very quick break over here, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about your background and ways that people can support the efforts of the weekend warriors, the soldiers that are out there serving the National Guard and the Army Reserve, whether it's in our COVID-19 efforts or any of the other missions that lead to folks in service around the world. I'm chatting with Colonel retired Paul Hettich, a retired Army colonel in the National Guard and the Army Reserve. Such a pleasure to have you on the air, and we'll be right back in just a moment.
Stop wasting paper in its place. AM 560, The Answer.
All right, welcome back, Chicago. You're listening to the show all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. You're listening to Get Down to Business. I'm your host, Shalom Klein. I'm back with Colonel Paul Hettich, a retired U.S. Army colonel who has served in the National Guard, Army Reserve, active duty. Such a pleasure to have you with me here on the air. Paul, let's talk a little bit about your background. You talked a little bit about some of your combat deployments in the past. Let's talk about how long you've been in the Army and some of your experiences.
Once again, thanks for having me on your show. I spent 30 years in the Army, actually 30 days and 7 days. And if I had my way, I'd still be serving. In fact, I did submit my retiree recall packet, hoping that they would call me back. But right now, it's my understanding they're just calling back medical forces. But once again, I'm a civil affairs and PSYOP officer, and also had branches with transportation, medical services, and Signal Corps. And I have 19 additional skill identifiers. Had the opportunity to old 12 Special Forces group in Arlington Heights, Illinois, all the way up to serving as the commander of the 451st Expeditionary Support Command in Wichita, Kansas, which was a one-star command before I was retired on September 1st.
And what is your current role, Paul? Why are you still so involved in the armed forces?
Well, I'm still very involved because, once again, I think like many of us, although we retire, we're still feeling in the opportunity that we want to continue to serve however we can. I'm fortunate in my civilian job that I work as a police officer now, but I'm also very fortunate to be appointed as the Army Reserve Ambassador for the state of Illinois. And I was appointed in that position in 2018 by our commanding general for the Army Reserves, Lieutenant General Charles Luckey. So I serve as a special government employee as one of the 3 Illinois state ambassadors.
That's fascinating. So what are some of your responsibilities and roles and requirements in that position?
Well, the Army Reserve Ambassador Program it's a key outreach program. And one of the ways that we serve in these positions, and one of the tasks is that we have significant ties to our communities, both at the state and local levels. And this allows us to develop awareness, advocacy for the Army Reserves, develop bridges between the communities and the nation. It's a way for us to continue our service after retiring and returning home, where we will be here for several years, unlike many others who perhaps come into a certain command position, serve for 2 or 3 years, and then go on to another command. Many of us as Army Reserve Ambassadors were appointed for a 3-year position, and then we may have the opportunity to continue to serve in our position for another term.
Fascinating. And we know that right now people are very fond of seeing a soldier in uniform and saying, thank you for your service, that sort of thing. What's a more appropriate way that people can show their appreciation and actually help those that are serving in uniform, helping in the current response efforts to COVID-19 or any of the other situations around the world?
Well, I think that's a great question and a great comment. I think one of the ways that hopefully your listeners can think about all of us who serve in the reserve component, the reserves and National Guard, is being twice a citizen. That's kind of one of our mottos here in the Army Reserves, is twice the citizen. That means that we're serving both the Army Reserves, but we're also having to maintain our civilian jobs, our positions with any sort of other organizations we have, but probably most importantly with our families. And that can be challenging, especially in terms like this, where we have a national crisis or an international crisis such as COVID-19. So once again, as you said and so forth, thank these service members, as well as all of our other first responders and everyone else involved with the current crisis. There's many ways to do it. Right now, I think thank you is probably the best, but there's other ways to do it through supporting other veterans organizations and so forth.
And for those that own companies and they might have open positions, would it be appropriate for them to look out to hire and employ weekend warriors?
Well, that's an excellent comment, and absolutely. It's one of the key components to so many of us who serve in the reserves is knowing that our employer supports us. Obviously, hopefully our family supports us, but if our employer supports us and understands the role that we play as a reservist, that helps both hopefully the employer, but helps us maintain that support for doing our job as well as for serving the military. So yes, absolutely. Supporting those employers who support those in the reserves.
Fascinating. And how can people get involved in some of the organizations that support the military, support the National Guard, support the Army Reserves? Tell us a little bit about where you're involved.
Well, there's many different companies, obviously, that are quite friendly in terms of supporting Army Reservists or any sort of reservist, be it Army Reserve, National Guard, and so forth. Many of these citizen soldiers bring unique skills to their civilian jobs that are also part of what they do in the reserve component as well. So it's kind of a win-win for both the civilian employers as well as for the military. There's various websites available through the Army Reserve that shows some of these partnerships between civilian organizations, employers, as well as the military. You can check there. Many of the veterans organizations, such as your VFW, your American Legion, your Reserve Organizations Association, your VA, they also have components and websites that have this information as well.
Well, Paul, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Paul Hettich, thanks so much for joining me on the air.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Imagine if your